Ask almost any evangelical Christian to summarize their faith, and you'll hear some version of this. Christianity is about having a personal relationship with Jesus so that you can be saved. It sounds simple, it sounds sincere, and it sounds deeply spiritual. But what if that way of framing the faith, however familiar, has quietly become one of our most serious spiritual problems? Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast where we confront the deeper questions beneath our personal struggles and collective crises. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. I am not a theologian or a philosopher, or at least by training. I am a PhD exercise physiologist with an interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. In this episode, I want to explore how the emphasis on a personal relationship with Jesus and the salvation of self, ideas that dominate much of evangelical Christianity, may actually be distorting the message and mission of Jesus. Not because relationship or salvation don't matter, but because when they become the center, something essential gets pushed to the margins. How we live, how we love, and how we participate in God's work in the world right now. And I want to suggest that this isn't just a theological imbalance. It is a spiritual problem. Let me begin with a clarification. I'm not arguing against a relationship with Jesus. I'm not arguing against salvation. Those are real, meaningful dimensions of Christian faith. What I am questioning is how modern evangelicalism has framed those ideas and what that framing has produced. Because when Christianity becomes primarily about my relationship with Jesus and my eternal destiny, the faith subtly bends inward. It becomes self-referential, self-protective, self-focused. And that orientation would have been largely unrecognizable to Jesus. Jesus did not walk around first century Palestine inviting people to a private, internal relationship with him so they could feel spiritually secure after death. He invited them into a way of life, a kingdom, a radical reorientation of how they related to God, to one another, and to the world. The language of personal relationship with Jesus is notably absent in the Gospels. What we find instead are words like follow, take up your cross, love your neighbor, sell what you have, forgive, serve, go, and do likewise. These are not introspective categories. They are embodied, communal, outward-facing demands. And yet, somewhere along the way, Christianity, in many churches, became less about formation and more about transaction. Believe the right thing. Say the prayer. Secure your salvation. Once that transaction is complete, the rest of life becomes optional add-ons, church attendance, moral improvement, maybe some service if you're especially committed. That shift is not neutral. It fundamentally changes what faith is for. When salvation becomes primarily about escaping hell and going to heaven, the present world becomes secondary. Suffering becomes spiritually inconvenient. Justice becomes political. Love becomes conditional. This is where John 3:16 has done enormous heavy lifting, but often in isolation. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. We stop there. We put it on banners, signs, and billboards. We turn belief into the central act. But Jesus doesn't stop there. John 3:17 says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." To save the world. Not just individuals, not just souls, the world. That changes everything. Salvation in the Gospel of John is not about removal from the world, but restoration from it, healing it, renewing it, reconciling it. NT Wright has been relentless in pointing this out. The story of the Bible is not about humans going to heaven. It's about heaven coming to earth. The resurrection of Jesus is not an escape hatch. It is the first act of new creation. And if that's true, then Christianity is not primarily about securing a future location. It's about living faithfully within God's redemptive project, here and now. This is where the emphasis on me and Jesus quietly undermines the teaching of Jesus himself. Because Jesus consistently locates faithfulness not in eternal assurance, but in external action. When asked about eternal life, Jesus doesn't say, "Make sure you believe the correct things about me." He says, "Love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself." When he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, the hero is not the most doctrinally precise person. It's the one who acts with compassion. When he describes judgment in Matthew 25, the criteria are unmistakably concrete: feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, caring for the sick. And notice this: the people who think they're secure are shocked. "Lord, when did we see you?" Their certainty didn't translate into love. That's the danger of salvation-oriented spirituality. It can create confidence without transformation. This is where I want to circle back to a common theme on this podcast, the idea of spiritual evolution. Spiritual evolution is not about becoming more enlightened in some abstract sense. It's about growing beyond fear-based motivation into love-based participation. Early faith often needs fear. Children need boundaries. Beginners need clarity. But mature spirituality moves beyond what happens to me and into how do I live in alignment with God's love. Teilhard de Chardin's concept of the omega point helps here. The omega point is the idea that all of creation is moving toward ultimate unity with Christ, not through coercion or judgment, but through increasing complexity, consciousness, and love. In that vision, Christianity is not about extracting individuals from a doomed planet. It's about participating in the gradual transformation of creation itself. And that requires something far more demanding than a personal relationship. It requires conversion of how we live. The tragedy is that many Christians are deeply assured of their salvation while remaining largely unchanged in how they treat others. We've produced believers who are confident about eternity, but indifferent to suffering. And if that doesn't trouble us, it should. Because Jesus never separates love of God from love of neighbor, ever. You cannot claim intimacy with Jesus while ignoring the people Jesus identifies himself with: the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, the stranger. That's why I believe the obsession with personal salvation is a spiritual problem. It trains us to look upward and inward, but not outward. It makes faith about security rather than sacrifice. It allows us to ask, "Am I saved?" while avoiding the harder question, "Am I loving?" Christianity was never meant to be a private spiritual experience. It was meant to be a public, visual way of life. A life marked by generosity instead of accumulation, by humility instead of certainty, by sacrifice instead of self-protection. When Jesus says, "Follow me," he's not offering spiritual reassurance. He's inviting people into a path that will cost them something. And that cost is precisely what salvation-centered theology often minimizes. Because if salvation is already secured, why risk anything? Why disrupt comfort? Why challenge systems that benefit us? But if Christianity is about participation in God's renewing work, then comfort becomes suspect. Neutrality becomes impossible. This is where we have to be honest. Much of American evangelicalism has been shaped more by individualism than by Jesus. Personal relationship language fits neatly into a culture that prioritizes self-expression, personal fulfillment, and individual choice. But Jesus calls us into a people, a body, a kingdom. You are not saved from the world, you are saved for it. And that reframes everything. Faith becomes less about what you believe and more about who you are becoming. Salvation becomes less about escape and more about alignment. Eternity becomes less about destination and more about direction. So yes, relationship matters, but relationship without imitation is empty. Yes, salvation matters, but salvation that does not produce love is incomplete. If your faith does not make you more patient, more generous, more compassionate, more willing to suffer for others, then something's gone wrong. And that something is not theological error alone. It's a spiritual problem. The good news is that Jesus' invitation is still the same. Not be certain, not be safe, but follow me. And following Jesus has always meant learning how to love God, neighbor, and the world God refuses to abandon. That is the work. That is the calling. And that is the path toward the fullness of life Jesus actually promised. Thank you for joining me in my spiritual evolution. Until next time, be good to yourself and be good to others.